Alright, before we begin, I just want to give a quick warning. This video is going to be discussing an extremely gory series of splatterpunk horror films. Depending on how ruthless the Content ID system is, there may or may not be some upsetting imagery in this video, or at the very least, descriptions thereof. Viewer discretion is advised, especially if you're a kid who subbed after watching my Beyblade video in flagrant disregard for the disclaimer on that very video. Enjoy!
If you should die before you wake...
Cool.
As I recall, my first exposure to the Terrifier movies probably happened back in 2019, when a friend of a friend at our LGS told me that they had recently watched the first movie for themselves, and it seemed like something they thought I would be interested in. These days, I can't help but wonder what it is that they thought of me. For those unfamiliar with the franchise, Terrifier is a series of independent slasher movies about a demonic clown named Art, and are known for being very, very brutal. To the degree that, frankly, I don't know how much I can really get away with even describing these movies without getting the video age restricted. Though it is more than likely an urban legend in the same vein of early filmgoers thinking that trains depicted on movie theater screens were actually going to hit them, the second and third movies in this franchise are infamous at this point for reports of people running out of the theater, vomiting, or even fainting as a result of the more extreme kill scenes, and I feel like this reputation is how most people tend to hear about the films in the first place. And yeah, if you were just to even read the written description of the bedroom scene in Terrifier 2, which I will not be describing in this video, then it's not that hard to imagine that people would have some pretty extreme reactions to these films. And that very brutality is why it's shocking that somebody as squeamish as myself loves these movies. That's right, paint my face and slap a bottle of Faygo in my hands because I am down with the clown, a statement I would not have expected myself to be making around this time last year. You see, I was already aware of these films by their reputation, and frankly, it was that very reputation that had kept me away for so long. I love horror, it is one of my favorite genres, but I am admittedly pretty squeamish. And that's where I feel like the Terrifier films tend to get done dirty even by the people who do love them. Because the fact that it is basically impossible to describe these movies without bringing up their brutal nature means that most people tend to assume that that's really all they have going on. And I'm just as guilty of this myself. For the longest time, I really only knew about these films from their dead meat reviews. I'm just as guilty as anyone of using James's videos as a way of gauging whether or not I'd be interested in watching a horror film for myself, and yes, I do recognize the issues with this approach, but I also really tend to only do this when it's a film I'm already convinced I won't like, but am interested in being convinced otherwise. And I don't want to pin the blame on Dead Meat here, because I do love them, but I definitely feel like I came away from the Terrifier videos with the wrong impression. Maybe it's because of how harsh the coverage of the original film was, fairly so because it's basically a proof of concept for the much better sequels, but I certainly got the vibe that these movies were nothing more than their brutal kills and a confusing and ultimately unsatisfying story.
Terrifier is a classic grindhouse film with no real story or characters to speak of, just a singular focus on shocking gore and violence. Plus, there's no fun flavor or tone to this thing. It's just kind of mean and bloody. I don't know, I just wish it had a little bit more below the surface. Terrifier was written, directed, co-produced, and edited by Damien Leone, which is a lot to have on one plate. And in the case of all those positions, it really shows. Terrifier's effects are all done practically and look amazing. So if that's all you care about in a horror movie, look no further. Because, as I alluded to earlier, Terrifier doesn't really have anything to understand. Aside from art and the special effects, there's nothing impressive or even adequate about this movie.
I could tell from watching the reviews that David Howard Thornton's Art the Clown was an entertaining figure to watch, but hearing the descriptions of the kills left me feeling like I would spend half the movie looking away from the screen for the sake of keeping my lunch down, so I just never bothered. It wasn't until I watched a video from Rockland Graves Productions entitled Terrifier 2 is so much more than gore that I found my curiosity piqued. While I was aware that these films did have a rabid fan base around them, this was the first time I had seen anybody going to bat for them as being more than just entertaining gore fests. I'm actually really glad I gave Evan's video a chance because I don't know that I ever would have ended up watching the films without his persuasion. I don't want to just bite his bit because it is a great video that you should watch for yourself after you finish this one and after you finish Terrifier 2, but what made the difference is that Evan takes the time to discuss why Terrifier 2's story has a lot more going on
on underneath the surface than one might initially expect.
As I said, I had heard that Terrifier 2 had actually taken great steps to establish lore for its world, but I had also heard from most viewers that they tended to find it confusing, half-baked, and ultimately unsatisfying. But in his video, Evan actually makes a very convincing case that the scattered bits of lore throughout Terrifier 2 not only fit together better than most people are probably giving them credit for, but that the whole they form is very interesting not only on its own, but for giving people room to theorize about. A notion that I find myself completely in agreement now, having watched the films for myself, and particularly after watching Terrifier 3. Dear Lord, Terrifier 3.
The lore of Terrifier's world begins with the simple tale of the people of Miles County being terrorized by a sadistic serial killer dressed as a clown, and spirals out of control into this tale of a cosmic battle between the forces of the damned and the divine, with the second film's lead character Sienna Shaw embodying the role of an angelic warrior counterpart to Art's demonic evil. And as so many other people have pointed out before me, the character of Sienna is where this franchise really shines. In the short span of just 2 movies, Sienna has achieved legendary final girl status, easily matching and perhaps even surpassing the all-time greats like Laurie Strode and Sidney Prescott. Lauren Lavera's Sienna is somehow at once vulnerable and badass, powerful yet fallible, and the ultimate foil to the impossible challenge posed by Art's very existence. While Terrifier 2 is a roller coaster of brutality, where it really shines is when we see Sienna rise up against Art, who has spent the entire runtime of the film to that point making himself into one of the most reprehensible slashers in the entire genre, and giving him that comeuppance that the audience has been begging to see.
And this is something that not every horror film does, but I absolutely love when it happens. When you get to see this horrific monster that has been brutalizing the cast of the film the entire time get the righteous beatdown that they deserve, oh, that catharsis can't be beat.
This is the genius of Sienna, a character that may even deserve more attention than Art himself. I challenge anyone to watch Terrifier 2 and not at least have the urge to pump their fist in the air when Sienna rises from her seeming grave, sword in hand, and takes the fight to Art. To me, this is the secret sauce that makes these movies really work. It is so easy to write a downer of a splatterfest where people just get the worst fate imaginable left and right, and you come away from the whole thing feeling empty because it's clear that the author didn't have much of an intention beyond squicking people out. But it's very clear when watching the Terrifier films that Leone is aware that that alone is not enough to carry a story.
Actually, if I can be completely candid for a moment, the first draft of this script was actually a lot more negative because I made a lot of comparisons throughout to horror authors who do exactly that. But in the end, I decided against it because I'd much rather use this platform to talk about the things that bring me joy than to fling around poo like I'm Art in the first movie. What I am getting at, though, is that if the Terrifier films were nothing but the shallow gore fest that most people, including my past self, expect them to be, then I probably wouldn't be making this video right now. One of the things that really fascinates me about these films is Art and Damien Leone's ability to tiptoe right up to the line of good taste and tickle it, but never go all the way over. Now, of course, where that line lies is going to be different on a viewer-to-viewer basis, and I wouldn't blame any of you for deciding that he does cross the line at several points. But for me, a large aspect of this is the intentionality of the experience.
When I'm watching a Terrifier film, I'm getting the vibe that for all of the reprehensible acts I'm witnessing on screen, I'm here for the same reason as Damien Leone and ultimately as Art himself. To have a good time. The aspect of these movies that tends to garner the most praise from its viewers is David Howard Thornton's portrayal of the Mad Murder Mime, and for good reason. Frankly, Art is just a delight to watch, as fucked up as it is to say. In almost every action he takes, he's wearing this big, goofy smile and emoting like he's the dog from Duck Hunt. To once again steal a comparison made by someone smarter than myself, he's Pennywise by way of Bugs Bunny. And it goes a long way in making these movies more palatable to the more squeamish members of the audience like myself. To briefly touch on what I mean, I am going to take a momentary detour into the kind of negative comparisons that I was really hoping to avoid making the entire video about. This is the novel Playground by Aaron Beauregard, and I am specifically showing you the back cover because I am not sure I can show the front cover on YouTube. Pretty much all of Aaron's covers are fantastic at drawing your attention due to their visceral nature, and that is something that I do commend about them.
If I were to tell you that Playground is a novel in which a rich older woman invites underprivileged children out to her castle in order to test out playground equipment that very quickly descends into a child-themed version of Saw because it turns out that she's evil and working with an escaped Nazi scientist, I wouldn't blame a single horror fan in my audience for thinking, wow, that sounds like a crazy ride, I gotta check this out. And then you discover, as many do, that for all his unique ideas, Aaron Beauregard as a writer is much more interested in grossing out the audience as much as possible than in making the most of his concepts. When I'm reading one of Aaron's stories, I get the feeling that his goal is to get the reader to throw the book down and say, well, I never. And for me, that's the crucial difference maker. I definitely think that there's space out there for authors who don't aspire to do much beyond disturb their audience. As the old saying goes, good art should disturb the comfortable and bring comfort to the disturbed. However, a lot of those same authors who get praised for doing such tend to have a point to their misery. I'm not somebody who necessarily believes that every story needs to have a point or a message, but if all you're doing with your work and all you're setting out to do is to disgust the reader as much as possible, I really can't help but wonder how much mileage you and your reader are going to get out of that.
I don't think that Terrifier is a franchise that has a message that it wants to send to its audience. Frankly, I doubt Leone would even want that. What Leone does understand, though, is why someone would want to watch a film like Terrifier. Leone, and most importantly David Howard Thornton, understand that a movie about a killer clown should probably have a clown who actually acts like one. A guy that is a complete goofball even though he's the embodiment of pure evil. A clown that is silly and unserious until it's too late. I mean, the costume shop scene in 2 and the bar scene in 3 are at once hilarious and deeply unsettling in a way that only a masterfully talented director and actor combination could pull off.
And that's the secret sauce to these films that I feel tends to get lost in a lot of the conversation. I had a bit of a revelation during Terrifier 3 while I was watching Art make blood angels while a Terrifier-themed Christmas song played in the background, that these are not just slasher movies. These are black comedies. Pitch black comedies. Vanta black comedies. So much so that most people would give you a look if they heard you describe them as comedies. But it is pretty much impossible to watch Art chewing the scenery in the second and third movies and not chuckle at least a little bit. And I think what really gives these films the ability to ride that razor-thin line between brutal, disgusting horror and pitch black comedy is the same thing that made me fall in love with them when I finally decided to watch the first Terrifier film late last year. The practical effects!
The Terrifier films have some of the coolest practical effects in any horror movie that I've seen in recent years. Practical effects that are, importantly, obvious when watching any of the kill scenes. Seriously, watch the behind the scenes for these movies and you will be amazed at how they pulled some of this stuff off.
And those practical effects are why I don't feel compelled to watch this movie through my fingers like I thought I might have to. Because it's very clear when watching the movie that what you're seeing is a puppet filled with corn syrup having the latex mask pulled off of it. And this is not a knock against the movie either. These are not cheap practical effects that are going to ruin your immersion. These are the kind of effects that you look at and you think, this is not something we can manage with a computer. And it doesn't need to look hyper-realistic to be effective. Certainly makes that Tom Savini cameo in Terrifier 3 pretty appropriate.
So now, I pose a question to you. What do you get when you combine a deeply talented cast, a creative wellspring of a director, a practical effects team capable of literal jaw-dropping visuals, and a dark sense of humor that knows exactly how far you can push the envelope without it becoming a slog? You get one of the most original and creative, entertaining horror film franchises in recent memory.
And ultimately, that's why I find myself making this video in the first place. As somebody who expected themselves to bounce off of this movie like a fist off of Gear 4 Luffy, I am shocked and delighted that that was not the case. Instead, I not only have really enjoyed watching the Terrifier films, they might be some of my favorite horror movies in general now, and I have discovered that there is a depth to these films that I have still yet to scratch the surface of. And if you don't believe me, watch that excellent 5.5-hour Terrifier retrospective video that I discovered like the day after I started recording this video. So I say to you, if you're somebody who doesn't think that you're probably going to enjoy the Terrifier films, I challenge you to give them a try anyways. I would even say you can just jump right in with number 2. If you're worried that like the 2 story breadcrumbs that carry over from the first movie are going to throw you off, then you can even just spend the 15 to 20 minutes it takes to watch the Dead Red Meat review. And then after you've watched Terrifier 2, come back to this video and tell me what you thought, because I think at least a couple of you might find yourselves pleasantly surprised. And for now, that's where we're going to leave it. So if you enjoyed this video, then please, I would really appreciate it if you threw me a like and a subscription. And hey, while you're here, why not check out another one of my videos? If you're a big horror fan, then I highly recommend the video I made about some of the coolest horror comics that came out last year. I think that at least one of them will be likely to speak to you. And as always, just remember that this has been a powerfully pointless video, but I hope you enjoyed it anyways. Stop on by the Clown Cafe.